Me to start?
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar with Dr. Kris Stoddart. And it's my great pleasure to introduce him to you, which I will do in a couple of minutes. But first, I will hand over to Christian, who will tell you a bit more about the framework in which this seminar is taking place and the various projects to which it relates. Christian.
Thank you. So I want to start off by thanking the European Commission for their support for organizing these events. This is an event that is linked to a number of different projects that we have. So firstly, there's the Jean Monnet network on EU counterterrorism, where we are looking with 14 different universities in 11 different countries. We're examining counterterrorism and security across the European Union and indeed outside of the European Union. We also have 2 partners in the Middle East. And we have organized a variety of different events. We also will organize another conference again in the summer, in June in Germany. And it's also part, and this project is based at the University of South Wales, but it also includes Dublin City University and a number of other universities. It also links up with the project EUACADEMY, which is a teacher training network based at Dublin City University, which is all about developing understanding and skills on the European Union for students in order to, in a sense, deal with some of the issues that Kris will be talking about in some shape or form, also related to Brexit and Euroscepticism more generally and so on, that are also very much at the heart of some of these discussions. It's also linked to the Jean Monnet Chair EUCT IRL, also based at Dublin City University, that is also involved in analyzing counterterrorism activities across the European Union. And we thank the European Commission very much for giving us this opportunity. This is with support of the European Commission. I think that's the precise wording that we need to use. It's with the support of the European Commission, but it does not necessarily express the views of the European Commission. So I think I've learned it correctly. So thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thanks very much, Christian. So just to introduce our speaker today. So Dr. Kris Stoddart is an associate professor for cyber threats in the School of Social Sciences, as well as working with the Hillary Rodham Clinton School of Law. And at Swansea, he is a member of CyTREC, the Cyber Threats Research Center. So he has written many books, journal articles, and book chapters, and in particular, he has recently completed Cyberwarfare Threats to Critical Infrastructure, which I warmly recommend to you. He has also recently published Russia's cyber offensive against the West and China and its embrace of offensive cyber espionage. So it's really a great pleasure to welcome him today. And we very much look forward to hearing more about the contents of the book, but also about the journey in developing the book, which I think is also very interesting. So Kris, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you to both of you for inviting me to give this webinar, to give a talk. I'll start with a sort of 2-pronged story. I'm doing this without any notes and without any PowerPoint. And so the origins of this lay in 2014, and probably a little bit preceding that as well. When I engaged with Airbus Group and the Welsh Government, looking at what to the outside it wouldn't be an exciting topic, which would be supervisory control and data acquisition systems and the cybersecurity lifecycle. SCADA or SCADA. It controls everything, as I came to realize, in a modern developed society. So everything from electricity to gas, all big public utilities. It's replete throughout industry and various component pieces, including RTUs, remote telemetry units, PLCs, programmable logic controllers, and so on and so forth. All of this is detailed in one of the chapters, I think the 2nd chapter, although my publisher reordered the chapter. So I'm going on the basis of what I wrote, but they label chapter, what I would label the introduction, they label chapter 1. So I may get them mixed up in the term of, in the way they've been published. that project ran through to 2017, and I found I learned a lot early on, going out and talking with people in industry and in intelligence agencies and in police forces and on in the cybersecurity frontline in terms of some of the big companies, some of the big providers, and trying to get a feel and an idea for what was going on, and hearing a lot about cyber warfare and hearing a lot about there's bits of espionage and there's a lot of cyber crime, and all of it sort of getting badged under this big grand title of cyber warfare, and all the headlines sort of coming out consistently, still aggregating a whole range of other activities, including cyber espionage and straightforward espionage and cyber criminal acts into the discourse and into an argument of cyber warfare. The other side is, as I was doing this journey, I was sort of thinking about these issues, gaining a lot of knowledge, but not writing very much down, because I was, well, I say not writing much down. 80% of that project work is still unpublished. Not that it's under an NDA or it's classified or anything like that. It's just a time issue more than anything. I got 2 articles out of that journey, one which was published in International Affairs and another that was published in Political Science Quarterly. So it's not a lot. And so come 2018, when I had time, I had about 2 years of time to write up, and I wanted to, what was in my mind, what I'd learned. Not the journey so much I'd been on, although it was the journey I've been on, but sort of, not annoyance, but a desire to want to talk about the war aspect of cyber war and what it actually means. And to try and do that, I began what was one book initially, just one, which is meant to be on purely cyber war. I didn't know what the subtitle would be, but cyber war. And I started to write it, and I had pulling out all the bits and pieces from conferences and what I'd had previously, and taking the bits of the unpublished work that I could, and sort of trying to build down a structure and thinking. Big part of it all, thinking through how we sort of incorporate all these multifarious events and the empirical data and the discussions that people are having and all sorts of other things. I got to a stage where I was looking at so much which did not fit the category that I'd started to set out. And that category was based, this is the cyber warfare part, on the Tallinn manuals and the Tallinn process. And I'd spent a year out in Tallinn, I'd lived out there, and I'd been in and around this native CCDCOE, the supreme center of excellence with such good people. And not so much got involved in the debate, but listened to them and listened to definitions of armed attack and of Stuxnet as a case study, and of the legal debates in Tallinn 1, but particularly Tallinn 2, which has now gone into a third process, Tallinn 3.0. And I remember talking with the then, I won't name people, not many, but the head of the CCDCOE then over dinner, and saying to her that I very much see not the Tallinn manuals themselves, but it's the underlying process. It's important, that discussion. And that discussion led me to think about the definitions put forward by the esteemed lawyers in the Tallinn process, who were thinking about, well, what constitutes warfare, what constitutes a legal response, what are the rules of engagement, and so on and so forth. They're massive books. They're two very, very detailed, very legalistic texts. So that I use as sort of baseline. But the outgrowth of that was I was seeing so much cyber espionage. So how and where does that incorporate itself into cyber warfare? And in so many elements it does, in things like pre-positioning, in latency, and in lying low within networks, in probing, in establishing backdoors, right across the life cycle, from both in terms of software and hardware, from the code base up and into firmware, chip level, potential vulnerabilities there. And all of this goes into the supply chains that form part of critical infrastructure and part of our everyday lives. I mean, the products we're using now were sourced in various parts of the world. You're very unlikely to know where, but you'll quite often have made in China on the back, or made in Taiwan, or made in various other parts of the software may not be, but the backbone hardware and the architecture is. And the same with critical infrastructure. It's bespoke. It's made by Siemens, it's made by Cisco Systems, it's made by Qualcomm, by Huawei, and a whole range of firms globally, big and small. It complicates the dynamic, but having an understanding of that layer is part of the sort of technical discussions that form part of chapter, I'm going to say chapter 2. It's probably chapter 3 in the running order of the publisher. So that needed separation out, hence the 2 other books where I've talked about the non-warfare-like espionage aspects. So that in the book itself, I was very careful to try and disaggregate and to make a clear line of argument of it must be armed attack based on the Tallinn process. So it must have a destructive potential or actuality. There's been very limited test cases, but some of the more notable ones, aside from Stuxnet, which I think personally is overused, kind of more than a decade old now, very specific, and for me, an act of cyber espionage, is things like Industroyer, which hit Ukraine, Crash Override, Dragonfly, and so on. Ukraine's been a big, big target for a number of years preceding last year into this. So these are sort of test cases I've used in the book, and used these ideas as a baseline, and to demonstrate, hopefully, and I say hopefully, but I also say sadly, very sadly, I'd rather, I was saying to Sarah before we began, in this odd case, I'd rather my hypothesis be proved wrong. And I've asked many times people in industry during the writing of the book, before doing the research of it, and after, when I've showed chapters of pieces to various people, particularly when I'm requesting permissions to reuse and to say, look, there's a surrounding context. None of them have said you're wrong. None of them have said the core argument is mistaken. I kind of wish it was, because I worry about this world and about what the implications are. So when we're talking about some of the actual threats, it could be, for example, the one I sort of go to is the potential for an explosion at a chemical plant, for example, where you change remotely or through an insider threat, change the pressures, change the readouts, change the chemical formula, the processes, and cause an explosion. So there's a direct then threat to life. But overlying that, or underlying it, is the biggest one of all across critical infrastructure, which includes, I won't mention the first one because I'm about to, but oil and gas, road, rail, transport, air, sea, maritime, ports, logistics, train switching systems, traffic control, the list goes on. And I detail that. There's about 17 different sectors the United States defines. Various other national governments define it very similarly, anywhere between sort of 14 and 20, but all of the same sort of sectors. The biggest one of all, biggest threat of all, is electricity. It runs everything. Everything else relies on it in a modern, developed society. And the way I would suggest you think about this is, I think Sarah and I and Christian will remember power cuts fairly regularly growing up, or irregularly, and everything goes off. Fridges go off. If they don't come on, you've got to throw the food away, and so on. The telephone system may or may not work depending on if it's on a separate connection. We're not used to it anymore. It's always on. We have water systems that are always on, almost always. and uncontaminated. You know, dams, for example, will regulate the flow of water in developed states, but they too are vulnerable to various forms of attack, and it's been attempted. The Bowman Dam in Rye in New York was attacked by Iranian hackers only, I think, 6 years ago, and they got into control systems. It was mitigated, but it's a warning, and there's lots of these warning signals alongside the big events. There's enough material out there, enough real-world experience, and if any of you have read my book or will read my book, you will see I've gone to great lengths to absolutely talk about government reports, about Idaho National Laboratory reports, about the cybersecurity industry, so people like Dragos, Symantec, and so on and so forth. Use them all the way through, because it's not hypothetical. I'm actually saying it's material, it's demonstrable, and it's writ large, and it's growing, and it's embedded. So if I go through my first chapter, I'm not going to go through it in detail, as Sarah says and knows, it is a big book. I freely admit it is a big book. I didn't intend it necessarily to be that big, but the reviewers and publishers suggested I add other things, not take them away, including Ukraine, which is an active war zone at the time of writing. Again, very unfortunate and tragically. So when I'm thinking about what cyber warfare is, I need it as a baseline to ask myself and pose the question, well, what is war? What do we mean by war? We think it may be normatively easily described and characterized. It's actually not so, and particularly in the last 20 to 30 years post-Cold War, where we've got a whole range of undeclared wars. We've got sub and non-state actors involved. We have territorial disputes. We have the rise of terrorism and elements of cyber terrorism. We've got a blurriness of territorial boundaries, territorial disputes. We've got ethno-nationalism, but a whole range of things taking place beneath the red line threshold of out and out state on state conflict at the sub-state level. It complicates that dynamic. So I needed to look at that and think about it. So what is war is a really important baseline question to ask. And it's not as easy as you may think. So I've looked at theory. I've looked at the United Nations definitions, legal definitions. I've looked at human rights organizations. I've looked at a number of different areas to understand the sort of baseline, and then gone into armed attack, which is the main baseline. It's instrumental violence. Part of two of my big thinkers, first chapter is called On Cyber Warfare, deliberately invoking and drawing on Carl von Clausewitz, the Clausewitzian framework, and the Clausewitzian Trinity, which is the Trinity is not what is many people suggest, you know, the state, the people, and it's chance, probability, violence is a political act. That's the framework. So building on that, and then into, well, we've also got something called hybrid warfare. So let's talk about hybrid warfare and how this has influenced the debate, or it is distracting us from a debate on and a concentration upon cyber warfare. So I have a discussion on that, and there are some crossovers, and particularly with cyber espionage. And I've continued to talk to a number of people about this, and the delineation points are sometimes not easy. You know, I'm not ever going to say I'm getting everything right. No one can say that. But what I hope to have done, particularly in this first chapter, is try and advance knowledge and to advance theoretical underpinnings of cyber warfare, and to make it a more cogent and tighter set of definitions, so that we're not just talking about cybercrime and espionage and just lumping it all together. And clear, focused definitions where we can say, yes, this is an act of cyber war clearly or blurrily, but at least we move that debate forward. Relatedly, I then go on to talk about just war theory and just war tradition, and the idea of imminency and of pre-preparedness and of just cause and of preemption, and ideas that it is creating a set of situations where it's incentivizing a hostile actor to go first, and it's placing the recipient in a position of systematic weakness and an inability to potentially respond should they be faced with a large-scale attack against their critical infrastructure. It's asymmetric, so it may not need peer competitors, and the United States has two main peer competitors in cyberspace, and that's China and Russia. China, almost by sheer quantity alone, which has a quality all of its own, I'd rank at least as a peer to the US, and in some quarters it's overtaken the US. So these are really important questions, but it also affects asymmetric relationships at lower levels beyond the big state powers. Just war theory and just war tradition can help from a legal perspective, and help national governments and also private industry from deciding and thinking about their own rules of engagement, how they respond, how we think about cyber offense, what's needed for cyber defense. And through that, I'm moving through, a theoretical foundation for the book. When I move on to the second chapter, I'm very much into the empirical side, talking about real world cases and detailing them, not to the extent where I'm really drilling down on it. There's subject matter experts out there better than I, who deal with this on a day-to-day basis. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, but what I'm trying to highlight and flag is in these, I think I've got about 7 cases out of, say, 20 sectors, but I've chosen the big ones, and I think electricity forms, well, I think it does form the biggest part, and it's replete throughout the whole book. But try and break them down and break down cases in specific sectors and why and how the vulnerabilities exist and how and where they can be exploited or have been exploited. So detailing that in a very systematic fashion. I'm trying to do it globally. I mean, I've got a Western concentration, but I'm very much saying these are global sets of issues. And looking at case studies anywhere from the Gulf of Mexico through to Ukraine, through to the Middle East, Shamoon, and so on and so forth, looking at a number of and lots of different cases and mapping them into different sectors and demonstrating again that the theory is turning into an actuality, and we have demonstrable cases where we can actually draw not just case examples, but we can show there are demonstrable threats to life and well-being. Moving on then, I go on to talk about how access is gained into remote-facing systems, which is something that we talked about before the webinar began, is this hyperconnectivity that we've absolutely embedded into developed societies, and which has grown more profound and more remote working because of the pandemic, where we're doing things like this, where previously I would have done it in person and talk to a visible real world audience, which I would have loved, I must say. That's creating gateways into systems, an increasing number of gateways. People want, I mean, for example, if you're a systems engineer and you've got to go out and try and patch a piece of code remotely, and sometimes in SCADA systems you can't, the system will fall down if you try and patch it. They run constantly, 24/7, 365 days a year. They're not upgraded. They just work. They run. They're often bespoke, lots of different pieces of hardware. So patching and upgrading is not an easy task. And if companies, big and small, do upgrades, system life upgrades, they're hugely costly. You get downtimes. and they have to perform into a cycle, and the cycle is a bathtub curve where reliability is high to begin with, it drops off during the lifetime, and then it needs replacement. If it gets patched or it gets upgraded, then the curve goes back up. It can't be done en masse. There's also a global shortage in professionals, which adds into this mix of it's not instantly solvable. None of these problems are they going to go on for however long, but certainly more than a generation, if not far longer. If a systems engineer can patch that remotely without needing to go into the field, and some of these field sites in the Middle East, for example, are the size of countries. It can be done remotely, or you can task an engineer to go out and say, right, I need you to do this, this, and this, but they've got access through external facing or through another means which you can gain access to external facing networks. And through that, it's opening up portals and gateways to hostile actors. And that's partly how they've gone in. They've also gone in through physical security, and there are insider threats. None of these are easy to guard against. None of this is instantly solvable. You can throw a lot of money at it. You can raise the barriers to entry, but it's not going to be a solution in and of itself so long as human-machine interaction takes place. And that will be ongoing for, again, an unknown length of time. I then lean into this in hacking the human. And there I'm leveraging cognitive and behavioral psychology to understand not just the motivations of the attackers, which are fairly well understood, I mean, particularly if it's cyber criminal, and there can be a linkage between cyber criminal, cyber espionage actors, and expertise can be brought in. Their modus operandi, their TTPs, their target techniques and procedures are pretty well understood. What we're less good at is understanding why human behavioral triggers are exploitable through social engineering. We're somewhere along in understanding why. What I've tried to do again in this book is linking it back to, well, how are they getting in? It's not just technical means. Quite often, it's an innocuous email. It's a PDF file that people will click on and it'll execute. It'll execute malicious code. And through that, they establish what's called a beachhead. And through that, they aim to get persistent access. And then through that, move laterally through networks, which is where you get into the realm of field devices and something called OT-IT convergence. So the convergence between front-facing part of the business, websites, intranets, and shared documents, files, and so on, into the OT side of the business, the operational technology, which is where you're into things that physically control equipment, which is where you're into SCADA and PLCs and RTUs and so on. They will control high-temperature processes, train switching systems, and to move electricity demand onto and from national grid systems, from electricity substations, and so on. All of these are physical processes. But because of this remoteness and this ability to control systems remotely, the vulnerabilities also increase, and the attack surface is incredibly wide. It's wide from an external hacking perspective, and it's very, very wide also from a physical perspective. A lot of places are security protected, but there are ways in. Also, people use social engineering and in a variety of plausible scenarios to get themselves into sites. There's a site on YouTube, which is a penetration testing team, which has been viewed something like, in my mind, it's on like 22 million times. But I looked fairly recently in the last 6 months, and I think it was 17 million, so a drop of 5 million. And it's a penetration testing team going into a physical site and being escorted through by bluffing their way through security, or through the person on the door, not necessarily security per se. A couple of times the police have been called, or the National Guard, but it's rare. Quite often they've got that pretext absolutely down pat, and people let them in and say, oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm obstructing you, but please let me help you. I'll show you where you need to go. You know, it's a helpful attitude. It's the nature of business in an open society, but it's exploitable. It taps into human nature, and it's quite insidious. I also relatedly then in the next chapter talk about non and sub-state actors, which I've talked about before, but I will talk about in detail in that. I'm clock watching at this point, and I'm going to move on to the conclusion where, one, I sort of go back to the first chapter and talk about, well, what is warfare, and reflect on what I've just written about in the preceding 5 chapters, 6 chapters, and muse on cyber arms control, and muse on international law, and on the progenitors of the cyber warfare argument, people like John Aquino and Richard Clarke, and the cyber skeptics were out there as well, and who some hold valuable arguments. And I'm not trying to create, you know, necessarily academic debate or fight with any particular group or people. I'm not interested. I care about getting or representing the world as is, not, you know, from an agenda point of view. And through that, trying to build a case for, well, we need to think about what the corollary of cyber war means, cyber peace. What sort of rules of the game we may need to establish between states, probably at the UN level, and the effects and effectiveness and the weaknesses of international law and the UN Security Council, and the anarchic nature of the structure of the state system itself, and how that's under challenge. And it's no more under challenge than it is at the present time. Sarah, I'm at about half an hour. I could go on for several hours, stroke days or weeks even. I may need coffee and some feeding and some sleep in between, but in the meantime, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Kris. You certainly have given us a lot to think about and to talk about. So I will just stop the recording here so that people don't feel inhibited if they have questions to ask.